1 minute. Done. So you think you've finished your screenplay, but have you? So you've printed out your screenplay and you've read through it. You've even made some notes. And you think you've come to the end of your drafts. You need to feel satisfied that you've got to that point where you can move on to the next stage, the query letter. And how do you write one of these? And what is a query letter? Query letters are the pitch that will ultimately sell your screenplay to an agent or producer. This is akin to knocking on the door and introducing yourself. Working with a screenwriting agency who specializes in query letters, Scriptmailer provides the service via their website and prompts for information about your screenplay. Typically, you fill out a number of form fields to provide what is required for the production of a query letter. So typically online with these query letter services like Scriptmailer, you fill out a number of form fields to provide the information required to create your query letter. What is a query letter? So a query letter is a document, a letter specifically, that ideally ends up in the hands of a prospective agent or producer, ultimately someone in a position to make a movie happen, someone who can take your story and pass it up the chain to interested parties who will produce your screenplay into a film. So the query letter is a document that introduces yourself, briefly pitches who you are, what you're presenting, and a brief. And I kind of refrain from using the word synopsis because synopses can take up quite a lot of space on a page. A query letter ultimately fits onto one page. The synopsis is really a brief synopsis that gives the highlight of your story. It doesn't necessarily need to have to get into lots of secondary characters and whatnot, and doesn't have to include all of the events. It's essentially painting a picture to sell your movie. It gives the nuts and bolts such that someone can read that and go, right, this is interesting. I want to know more. Let's contact this writer. So your query letter will also have a very brief author bio. And it's not a biography that goes into where you went to school and the fact that you like motocross cycling and what you do at the weekend. If you do something at the weekend that's very relevant to the movie industry and specifically to screenwriting, then that can of course bolster your chances and your believability as a writer. But typically we end up seeing a lot of people writing far too much in their biographies, listing all the jobs they've had, the fact that they used to be a lawyer and whatnot. If you've written a legal drama and you happen to have been a lawyer, definitely you include that in your bio, but you wouldn't list all of the legal firms that you took part in. Ultimately, the query letter leaves us begging for more, but how to write a query letter is very much something for a different video. So what I want to do here with this video is talk about two boxes on these online services that people often fall short with. And it's so important to get this right. You do not want to be in the camp of people who are not going to proceed for failing these. So as I said before, there are two boxes I want to highlight as this is where many clients are failing. And you don't want to fail at the stage of your query letter in its presentation or lack of information. Otherwise, you're never going to get someone to read your screenplay. So ultimately, to get success here, you need to shine and provide worthy information. So we're talking about these two boxes here. What is your story about? And the wording is going to differ between different online services. But if I go with Scriptmailer, a company I quite often work with, the box is entitled, What is your story about? And then the second box is author biography. Might be labeled author bio or about you. However, the point is these two boxes are what you need to fill with information, whether you're copying and pasting from another document or you're typing it live into the box on the website. You've got to get these right. So let's look at some examples of where people fail and what isn't good. So really, with the what's your story about, this is begging for a short synopsis. And at this point, you don't really need to worry if you're using a service to write the query letter for you, if yours ends up being a little bulkier, because ultimately, as part of this service, the editor will cut that down a bit. However, that doesn't mean you want to be sticking 4 or 5 paragraphs, 2 pages of text into this box. The editor will just be making it a little bit more efficient, changing the language when necessary, keep it flowing, and cut out anything irrelevant. What we don't want is for an editor to be manufacturing story. An editor shouldn't be filling in the gaps for you. It's not their job to bolster your story and have to make stuff up to have that work. You have to bear in mind that for the cost of writing a query letter, there simply isn't time for an editor to refer back to you to get this right. Because then you're talking about emailing back and forth, the job then turns into days, and it's just not cost effective. You also don't want an editor entering their voice into your work, otherwise it isn't true to your tone and storytelling. So these examples. What I'm going to do here is paste in to the story about field an example of a poor submission, just so you can see it in context. The screenplay follows a lazy, unemployed young woman who lives with her parents. She is forced to work due to a new scheme proposed by the state, where the unemployed are sent into the National Guard, which creates animosity between the unemployed, the state, and the National Guard. Now, at first glance, it might seem, there's a story there, but ultimately this isn't enough. Essentially, we have no sense of what's really going to happen, what's really at stake, and ultimately, how does a story finish? What's achieved? And is this something really worth making? So these pitches, synopses in your query letter are ultimately begging the question, so what happens? So the job here is to sell your story to the industry. Remember that you're the one with the story in your head. You ideally have the arc and ending in your mind. And this all needs to be pretty clear in the submission. Let's look at this example here. Here I have a document set up to illustrate the kind of thing that we do get submitted. This is anonymized and heavily edited, but it gives an idea of something that as an author you might think, well, that'll do. But you have to realize when you make that call, you've got the story in your head and it makes sense to you. But knowing the story as you do, as you have worked on it for so long, you know the characters, you know the trajectory, and you know the ending. Does that translate into what you've written? Maybe you've butchered your own synopsis and removed the wrong bits. So looking at this, we're mentioning things that aren't necessarily pertinent to what a query letter needs to show. You need to intrigue a potential producer or agent with your query letter. So this brief synopsis really needs to cut to the chase. And you do have to remove bits that aren't pertinent to the overall plot. What we also have here is a problem with clarity. We've got this insinuation that Tom and Shane, assuming these are both male characters, they're friends who then realize they have feelings for each other. It goes on to imply that Tom and Shane date and break up. But what's not clear is that we've already said Jenny is interested, and it creates a little of ambiguity and a clarity issue which you don't want in your brief. Jumping from Shane is dying to a flashback, and we see the multiple times that Shane hinted or wanted to say, this is all very obscure and doesn't really lead us into seeing a cohesive ending. So ultimately, this is a weak submission. So as an editor, there's a feeling like we need to create story. We need to create the sense of 3 acts. We need to imply the beginning, the journey in the middle, what's at stake, what's against the hero, which we assume here is Tom, and then ultimately what happens at the end. In this example, what we are seeing is something that's a very weak pitch. and ultimately it implies a journey. But why is this journey happening? Why is it relevant? Why should this story be made? What's the reason she goes on this journey? Getting entangled in romantic relationships. And there's no real setup. There's nothing implying any sense of antagonism. What's against her? It doesn't necessarily have to be another character, but, is love against her? Is life against her? This really does miss the beat as far as a good, solid middle and end. I mean, there's a beginning, but what's the trigger? Why, has she fallen out with parents? Is it that there's just a lack of men on the island? There's no reason for the story to exist. That's probably the number one issue. So as far as an editor trying to turn this into a query letter that sells a story, they're really going to struggle. And all they really can do is copy and paste what you've provided and then hope for the best. And that's really not a strong query letter and leaves the editor feeling really lacking. But there's nothing they can really make of a submission like this. They can't manufacture story. They can't introduce the fact that she falls out with her brother, gets in a huff, the local boys oust her because she's upset the family, whatever it's going to be. It has to be true to you as the author, and you therefore need to have a strong pitch. Now, it could be, of course, a screenplay is lacking the story elements required and lacking the Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 structure, and that's a different matter. You ultimately want to be approaching the query letter stage with a good and solid screenplay. This example, just to illustrate, certainly in the brevity of that mini synopsis on the query letter, you don't want to be writing a sentence like this. You cannot say the dramatic events will follow one after another. You can't say, yeah, I've written a screenplay and there's drama in it. What's the reader to think? What are they going to conjure up? It's got to be drama relevant to whatever your story is. So you have to spell that out. You can't brush over things with a sentence like that. So keep in mind your pitches, they can be a little bit longer, but certainly nothing longer than a page. The editor will cut those down as much as required, but you need to provide the nutritious information in the first place and the sense of a solid story. Now, when it gets to your author bio, as I said a little earlier, you want to be putting in relevant information, something that's relevant to screenwriting or specifically the story you're pitching. And one thing I must mention here, one query letter goes for one pitch, one story, one screenplay, whether it's a TV show, TV pilot, or a movie. You don't write one query letter to try and sell more than one script. So your author bio is your brief chance to display your accolades. If you did go to film school, if you did take some screenwriting courses, any previous screenplays you've written, not necessarily naming them, but you might say, I've written 3 screenplays. And you would potentially put any competition, notable mentions or wins. But you don't want to be going too far into, I love screenwriting, it's the best thing in the world. And you don't want to put irrelevant information in there or sound desperate and look like you're just trying to fill a gap that you are really struggling with. Ultimately, you're a writer. You should be able to write something, manufacture a little bit of detail if you don't have accolades and prior screenplays under your belt. But just be sure that if you do present that you're a soccer player or you're the quarterback at high school and your screenplay is about aliens, the editor for your query letter is going to cut that information out. It's just not relevant. You have to remember that these agents, producers are busy. They have so many submissions, and to get through a query letter and read more information about grandma's cookies or how much you love BMW cars, etc., they just don't have time for it. They need to be able to get through a query letter quickly and efficiently, get a taste for something and know that they want to pursue it. Okay, I hope all of that was useful. And if you want to write a query letter, then please do go ahead to the Script Mailer website, link below in the description, and you can find a downloadable guide on how to write a query letter. If you want one written for you, you can come through Screenplay Prep or go direct to Scriptmailer. Either way, it's the same service, and we can write one for you based on the information that you put in the boxes as I have just described. Best of luck, and I'll see you in the next video.
If you found that video useful, please consider liking and subscribing. That will tell YouTube that I'm worth watching and ensures I can produce more educational content into the future.